Everyone. We'll just wait a few moments for some more attendees to join us, but so excited to have Bob Baxley here today. Wish we had some oh, you're so welcome. I wish we had some fun music. I know we'll get better and better at this as we go. Exactly. You can sing for us. Wonderful. Well, I don't want to spend too much time just, on spinning my wheels here. So I'll just dive into an intro and we'll get to the main event as quickly as possible as folks kind of begin to join us. So hi, everyone. My name is Kirsten Byron. I'm VP of Operations here at Pear Venture Capital. If you don't know us well, we're a venture capital firm that really helps early stage companies go from that very early idea all the way to kind of their product market fit stage and beyond. We call it 0 to 1, and have loved working with founders for the last 7 years. Our team of investors, we think of ourselves more like founders with a checkbook than anything. Between the 7 investors, they've started 8 companies. So really a wonderful team to give advice, and a wonderful network and Pear community, many of which are here today joining us. So with that, thank you, Bob, for joining us today. Bob's going to give us a little talk on conditions, constraints, and conviction. And when we first started talking about what Bob would talk about today, this title just struck me. Just given today and where we are, we have a lot of new conditions, a lot of new constraints. We definitely have some conviction out there. So excited to have Bob here. He's a design executive who's led design at Yahoo, Apple, Pinterest, and now he's at ThoughtSpot as SVP of Design and Experience. So excited to have him today. And he's done so many great talks on, design, of course, but also on things like culture and management. So go check those out. Many of them are available on YouTube. So I'm just going to let Bob just take it away from here and, talk to all of us about kind of his thoughts around these themes of conditions, constraints, and conviction. And then we'll take questions. So we'll do kind of whole talk and then questions. So the entire time, if you're thinking of questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function in Zoom. And then the entire time, we'll be making sure we take note of those questions and get as many of them answered by Bob at the end. Sound good? Excellent. Well, take it away, Bob. So excited to have you here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. We're going to have some fun. I'm going to start out with this. Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. This is Bob Baxley broadcasting to you live from the studios of KDUX, located in beautiful downtown Los Altos, California, in the heart of Silicon Valley. It always gets a laugh. I can't tell if it's getting a laugh, but I'm hoping it's getting a laugh. I hope everybody is getting some food. And there it is. Julian tells me it's a laugh. That's very nice to know. I would do my Robin Williams, Good Morning Vietnam, but I have teenagers at home and they're still asleep and I would wake them up, which is kind of sad. I am going to jump into my slides here. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go here. And, this talk I developed a few years back. Actually, it was for a TEDx event at Los Gatos High. And it's such a fun talk for me to give. So I really appreciate the opportunity. It's 3 of my favorite stories. And that's really kind of what it is. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I don't have some fantastic framework or anything. It's just some really great stories that, as Kirsten mentioned, I think strangely speak to the moment we're living in. Because we are definitely living in a period of different conditions, some unexpected constraints, and it's going to take a little bit of conviction to get through some of this stuff. So with all that, away we go. 3 stories. Number 1, the beep heard round the world. So Friday, October 4th, 1957, at some time, I'm not going to try to interpret what that is, we have this. The launch of a modified Soviet R-7 rocket, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, and it's lifting off from the plains of Kazakhstan carrying a 23-inch ball that just a few minutes later would become the first man-made object ever to orbit the Earth. Now, I was thinking about this photo when I was out walking earlier today, and I just want to pause and make a point here that even though this isn't quite SpaceX, Elon Musk worthy, I just love the design of Soviet rockets. I think we don't really appreciate the industrial design of rockets and the lettering on the side of rockets. The Saturn V that took guys to the moon is a phenomenal rocket, but I don't know if it's particularly imaginative in its shape. But when you look at the Soviet rockets, there was something cool about the way they did those flares at the bottom. I just think it's awesome. So this, anyways, is the rocket that carried Sputnik into space. This is a hand sketch of Sputnik, obviously. Sputnik is a Russian word for companion, but for obviously people in the West, not exactly a comforting idea that there was what they called a Russian moon orbiting the Earth. Again, this is something that's the size of a big giant basketball going around the Earth, the first man-made object ever to orbit the Earth. There's quite a few of those up there now. It was sometimes described as a basketball with whiskers. To me, though, it kind of looks a little bit like a jellyfish. So, and that's what it looks like in sketch. This is what it looked like in real life. It was in orbit for about 90 days, and it transmitted a steady beep at both 20 megahertz and 40 megahertz, which made it really easy to hear for both amateur and professional radio nerds around the world. And that was really the purpose of Sputnik. They wanted to put it up there, and they wanted to make it beep so that everybody could know it was there. And I sort of laugh, like you could imagine the creative brief to the team working on Sputnik. It's basically put a radio beacon in orbit, make sure everybody knows it's there. So, you know, you have to imagine that there's this beeping thing going around the Earth, and in the context of the Cold War, this is a pretty upsetting thing for Americans. But there's a couple of guys at Johns Hopkins University in the applied, listen now for the sound. It turns out I can't play the sound for you, a little technical snafu on my part, but if you go and you just do a Google search for the sound of the Sputnik beep, you can hear it. And it's just sort of staticky, steady beep. But it's a very strong, just doot, 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 same frequency, very specific interval. And those are important variables to keep in mind. Yep. So these are the guys I want to talk about. So on the two gentlemen on the left and the right, this is William Geyer and George Wiffenbach of the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. And they did something kind of interesting. So when the rest of us heard Sputnik, we thought, well, that's sort of disturbing. There's like this beep emanating from space. But when they listened to Sputnik, what they were able to do is use the effect of the Doppler shift, so that the effect that changes the sound frequency of a train horn as it comes towards you and then goes away from you, it compresses and then expands the sound wave. They use that same concept to measure which way Sputnik was traveling. And within a relatively short period of time, I think it was within a few hours, certainly within a day of Sputnik launching, they were able to figure out the orbital trajectory of Sputnik. Just pretty phenomenal. I suspect they had to do a lot of that math by hand, which is obviously beyond my capacity right now. The guy in the middle, though, is also an interesting character here. This is Frank McClure, and he was also working there at Johns Hopkins. And Frank went to him and he said, guys, like that is a cool trick. You're able to calculate the orbit of an object moving in space, and you were able to do that by fixing a position on the Earth. But I sort of wonder if you could do the opposite. So if you had a fixed position on the Earth, or I'm sorry, if you had fixed objects in space, you had fixed objects in space, could you calculate something moving on the Earth, right? So he flipped the equation. Instead of saying, I know where I am on the Earth and I can calculate something moving in space, he said, if I know where I am in space, can I calculate something moving on the Earth? And they went away for a couple of days and they did the math and they came back and they said, well, not only can we do that, that's actually an easier thing to do. Now, you might wonder why Frank was asking this question, but as all things Cold War, it has to do with being able to launch missiles into Russia. He was actually responsible for trying to figure out how to target Moscow from submarine-based missiles, submarine-based missiles moving around the ocean. And so his problem was that he needed to hit another place on the Earth, a known place on the Earth, from a moving place on the Earth. And he had this idea that if we could get satellites in space at a specific orbit and where we knew where they were, we might be able to do that calculation. And of course, that idea was first the Tyrus navigation satellites that actually went up in the early 60s using a similar technique and method to what Sputnik was using with the Doppler shift. And then of course, later gave way to the GPS system that we all kind of take and use for granted today. So you wouldn't think that like this little basketball going into orbit and beeping at regular intervals would turn into something like GPS. But Frank here, he was the guy that kind of had this realization like, oh, wait, the game's changed. Like the conditions here have really changed. I can put something up in space and I can use that to solve a problem that I, up to this point, had no great solution for. And of course, it's hard to imagine today, getting by without GPS. If you've never had a chance to go research GPS, I strongly recommend you just do a little time on the internet and look at it. It is a phenomenal, phenomenal piece of modern infrastructure. System of about 30 satellites, which transmit extremely accurate time codes. They're all synchronized to atomic clocks. And basically what happens is your phone locks into 4 satellites at the same time, and then doing some calculation, it receives those time codes from the different satellites, and then looking at the differences in the time codes, because that is explained by how far away the satellites are, because the time codes have to travel further. By looking at those time differences, it's actually able to calculate the intersection of these spherical things and figure out where you are in space. Where you are in GPS land. So it's definitely worth reading about. It's an amazing piece of infrastructure controlled by the U.S. Department of Defense. But again, kind of all started with Sputnik and sort of a very unexpected consequence. The conditions changed. We can put stuff in space now. How else can we solve problems now that we have that new capacity? So that's story number 1. Looks like we got through that pretty quickly. Story number 2. This one's about constraints. A revolution born of 236 words. This story starts around the same time as the Sputnik story, Monday, May 24th, 1954, with this copy of Life magazine, with Kay Ballard doing something on the cover here. And it starts with this writer here, John Hersey. Now, John Hersey was actually a well-known journalist at the time, and he wrote a long piece in that particular issue of Life magazine talking about how American children were not learning to read at the rate they needed to and were falling behind their Russian counterparts. Again, the context of this Cold War and always concerns about keeping up with the Soviets. So in John's article, he said, in the classroom, boys and girls are confronted with books that have insipid illustrations depicting the slicked up lives of other children. All features of normally courteous, unnaturally clean boys and girls. In bookstores, anyone can buy brighter, livelier books featuring strange and wonderful animals and children who behave naturally, i.e. sometimes misbehave. And then he kind of went on to say, why should our school primers not have pictures that widen rather than narrow the associative richness the children give to the words they illustrate? Drawings like those of the wonderfully imaginative geniuses among children's illustrators, Tenniel, Howard Pyle, Dr. Seuss, and Walt Disney. So he was basically saying, education kind of sucks. This, Jack and Jill went up the hill and Dick and Jane and all that stuff was just super boring. And that's why kids weren't learning. So it's actually in a different context, kind of an interesting story about trying to use things that are more entertaining to kids to help them learn. But at any rate, in this last sentence where he mentioned Dr. Seuss, that caught the attention of Dr. Seuss's editor, a guy named William Spalding. And William Spalding put together a list of 300 to 400 words that every 6-year-old is supposed to know. And he gave that to Dr. Seuss. And he said, hey, do you think you could write a book using just these words? And this is the list of words here. I'll give you a second to take that in. But as you can see, not particularly complicated words. I was actually earlier today looking for the word together because I think it's supposed to be on this list, but I don't see it here. But the most complicated words are something like something, playthings, nothing. Everything else is super short. This is a tough list of words to write a book with. And this is all Dr. Seuss, had to choose from when he was working on Cat in the Hat. Now let's back up just a second to talk about Dr. Seuss himself. Here he is sketching the Grinch. His name, of course, is officially Theodore Geisel. His friend's name is Ted. And he started using, I love this bit about him. He started using the pseudonym Seuss when he was an undergrad at Dartmouth, and he was caught drinking with some friends. And he was caught drinking during Prohibition. And so he started publishing under a pseudonym, Seuss, and that became the moniker that all these children around the world now know him by. Who knew? A moniker that started as an alcoholic way to escape getting busted for underage drinking and becomes the person everybody knows as one of their favorite children's authors. So as part of that, he was banned as part of the drinking episode. He was banned from all extracurricular activities, including writing for the school newspaper. But instead of giving up writing, he started publishing under a pseudonym. And then after college, he worked in advertising and wrote for magazines. He was married. He was married, widowed, and married again. But he never had children. If you ever go and watch TV interviews with him, he's actually unbelievably awkward around children. So even though he had an amazing imagination and obviously cared tremendously about children and wanted to create something great for them, unbelievably awkward around kids, like just kind of painfully so. This is his first book that he wrote for kids, very first children's book by Dr. Seuss. And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. Those of you who have kids probably have quite a few Dr. Seuss books around your house. The first books he started writing were the larger scale books that were really intended for adults to read to their kids. Cat in the Hat's a different type of book I'm going to get to in a second, which is the reading books. But to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street was his first. And you kind of, if you've read much of his stuff, you kind of know the cadence and the rhythm, and there's obviously a poetic nature to all of his writing. And my understanding is he came up with the idea when he was traveling with his wife, and they were on a steamship coming back from Europe, I believe. And he just got entranced with the rhythm of the engines. And there was something about that rhythm, and it got him going with some of the syllables and how he thought about the cadence of the sentences. And that was part of the inspiration for this book. And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. But after a few decades of writing for magazines and advertising, he started focusing more on children's book. This particular book was rejected 27 times. All the great stuff always is. Keep that in mind. But was ultimately published in 1937. And he published 5 more children's books before the start of World War II. And then during the war itself, he actually drew quite a few political cartoons, drew over 400 in 2 years. And he was an editorial cartoonist for a left-leaning daily newspaper. But then after the war, he returned to writing children's books. But he really wanted to write books that weren't just, they just weren't throwaway stories. I mean, if you really look at his books, in almost all of them, there's a really interesting and powerful moral or political tone that comes through them. This is one of my favorites. I'll just give you the opening stanza here. It's the 15th of May in the jungle of Newell, in the heat of the day, by the cool of the pool, splashing, enjoying the jungle's great joys. Horton the Elephant heard a small noise. If you haven't read it in a while, you should go back and read it again. The real story, of course, of Horton Hears a Who is a person's a person, no matter how small. And I don't know, just saying those words, that seems like a pretty powerful message even for today. I'm kind of thinking we should maybe put that on a poster and go hold that up at one of the protests somewhere. Person's a person, no matter how small, 1954. 4 years later, Horton the Turtle. This is really a story about Hitler as much as anything. And to give you a little brief quote here. And today the great Yertle, that marvelous he, is king of the mud. That is all he can see. And the turtles, of course, all the turtles are free. As turtles and maybe all creatures should be. 1961, Sneetches. Again, here's another great quote. But McBean was quite wrong, I'm quite happy to say, that the Sneetches got really quite smart on that day. The day they decided that Sneetches are Sneetches and no kind of Sneetch is the best on the beaches. Another just incredibly powerful message for today. Just such a great entrancing book. So if you've got any of these laying around, I hope you'll go read them later today because they are amazing. The illustrations obviously are stupendous. One of my favorite Dr. Seuss books, the Lorax. Quote, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Still an incredibly relevant environmental book. And then one of his last books, the Butter Battle book from 1984, kind of during the height of the Cold War, with nuclear annihilation kind of hanging over all of us. The closing little bit. Grandpa, I shouted, be careful, oh gee, who's going to drop it? Will you or will he? Be patient, said Grandpa. We'll see. We will see. So, if you go read these books, and I'm sure many of you have, you'll know that Dr. Seuss is not a guy that could easily be constrained by this set of words. I mean, he didn't really take the English language as much of a constraint. In fact, he kind of invented a lot of his own words, including the word nerd, came from a Dr. Seuss book. So, to imagine him having to deal with this, and one of the scholars that writes about Dr. Seuss has this great quote. He says, Seuss was used to inventing words when he needed them. So to stick to a word list was a huge challenge. And so Dr. Seuss said, I read the list 3 times and almost went out of my head. I said, I'll read it once more. And if I can find 2 words that rhyme, that'll be my book. And as he read it that last time, he found cat and hat that rhymed. And he said, that's going to be the title of the book. And then he was kind of off to the races. So when he got that, he started working on the primer. He figured he could knock it off in about a week or so. It took 1.5 years. This is one of the in-process sketches. If you ever get a chance to read about Dr. Seuss's process, it's actually quite phenomenal. After he had some financial success, him and his wife moved to La Jolla, down near San Diego, and he had a studio that had cork boards along the sides of both walls. They had super long studios, and he would do these illustrations and pin them up on the cork boards and just kind of live inside his books. And each one of the bigger books, all the ones I was describing earlier, they each took about 1 year for for him to write. And he would do somewhere between 500 to 700 different illustrations for each one. And obviously when we read them today, they all seem pretty straightforward and simple, but then none of them start out that way. It's just, I don't know. I think it's very, so it's very moving to think about Dr. Seuss, just him and his wife, no kids around, pacing up and down through this cork-lined studio, staring at all these illustrations and trying to figure out Horton Hears a Who, or the Butter Battle book, or Go Dog Go, somebody else, sorry, or Mr. Brown Can Moo, Can You? Of course, this turns into the finished illustrations like this. Again, Cat in the Hat's printed, for those of you graphic design nerds, 3-color printing, which is one of the things that really makes all of his kids' books, I think, really pop visually, is it's all solid color printing. He never used the full color stuff. So it's very strong primary colors with really magnificent fields of ink. Again, he said it would take he thought it'd take a couple of weeks. It took over a year and a half for him to do this. I kind of think of Cat in the Hat. It reminds me a little bit of the movie Dumbo or the book Where the Wild Things Are. I mean, it is such an amazing and perfect work of art that it's kind of hard to imagine somebody ever had to create it, that somebody had to sit there and invent the whole thing. It almost seems like it just arrived on the planet fully formed. But of course, that's not how it happened. It took him 18 months to write. And one of the authors I like a lot is a guy named Julian Barnes. And in one of his books, he's got this great quote. We have to remember we have to remember the artist at work. What's obvious to us at the start was only apparent to them at the end. So I hope when you get a chance to read some of these books, and if you have kids at home, like sit down and read them. Horton Hears a Who tonight. It's just a phenomenal experience. So the book, obviously immediate critical acclaim and financial success, sold over 1 million copies in the first 3 years. And then it led to this creation, this whole other branch of books that they called the beginner books, and a whole kind of new publishing arm there. Some of the other ones, Mr. Brown Can Moo, Go Dog Go, Green Eggs and Ham, and others by a variety of authors, including P.D. Eastman, who wrote Go Dog Go, sorry, and some of the other ones. Mr. Brown Can, Green Eggs and Ham is interesting because if the constraints for Cat in the Hat weren't hard enough, he dialed it up with Green Eggs and Ham, which was written on a bet that he could write a book using, I want to say it was like 25 different words or 50 different words. It was like a really limited number of different words that led to that book. In 1983, he said, Cat in the Hat, he said, it's the book I'm proudest of because it had something to do with the death of Dick and Jane Primers. And the thing that's kind of interesting when you really back up and you look at Cat in the Hat, it's actually pretty revolutionary. You have to imagine, again, it comes out in the mid 50s when kids were supposed to be seen and not heard, and we're supposed to be, clean and not getting into trouble. And it's a book about some kids that get into kind of a lot of mischief, and the cat comes and like all sorts of crazy stuff happens, and kids are kids and they kind of get everything put back together, and mom doesn't really need to know what happened. And again, in the context of the mid 1950s, that's a pretty revolutionary idea. So Dr. Seuss is an amazing character. Again, that I can't recommend the books enough, but Cat in the Hat in particular, I think is a great example of how some of the best art, and I think some of the best products, some of the best buildings, like a lot of the things that we look around in the world and we marvel at and we think of as these incredible expressions of creativity and imagination, they really start with these pretty significant constraints. So you kind of have to lean into the constraints, and you have to relish them, and marinate at them a little bit. Even though I think maybe our natural tendency at the beginning is to try to push against them and fight them. But if you'll relax and kind of lean into them, there's a lot that can happen in the context of the constraints. So here we have Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel. That's story number 2. Story number 3, Somewhat as a Voice in the Wilderness. Now, in case you can't tell from the picture over my head there and my little Lego Apollo lunar module, I'm a bit of a moon Apollo nerd. I could talk about it all day, and I often have, to the boredom of my family. This story starts July 21st, 1969, with this famous picture. All of you know this picture, Buzz Aldrin on the surface of the moon, Apollo 11. This was a little over 50 years ago. Kind of sad that we probably couldn't do this today, but So I like to point out this is something our grandfathers did with T-squares and slide rules. And it is, to my mind, the most significant and amazing peacetime accomplishment of anything that's ever happened in human history. 12 people walked on the moon over the course of 3 years. 24 people traveled to the moon in the course of about 5 years. It is phenomenal. The one thing I always point out about this picture is if you look in the visor of Buzz here, if you can see in the visor, this is the only photograph of Neil taken from the surface of the moon. So Neil Armstrong, of course, is the first man to walk on the moon, but Neil had the camera. And so like all the pictures are of Buzz, except this one with the reflection. So, you know, for you parents out there who are always the one holding the camera, remember on the family vacations to pass the camera around a little bit. You don't want to only be remembered because you're in the reflection there. But the story of Buzz walking on the moon, Buzz and Neil walking on the moon, doesn't start in 1969, obviously. It actually starts years earlier in 1916 with this guy, Yuri Kondratyuk. Yuri Kondratyuk was born in 1897 in Ukraine, died in 1942 in Russia fighting against the Nazis in World War II. And yeah, I kind of have to imagine him in 1916. So in 1916, he's about 19, 20 years old. And, you know, 1916's what, about 10 years after the Wright brothers flew. You know, people, there's been a couple of movies now made about, you know, theoretically people going to the moon, at least indulging that fantasy of going to the moon. You know, the I don't know why, but the moon suddenly felt closer in 1916. Obviously, it'd been with us throughout all of human and natural history. And I just like to imagine Yuri walking around in Ukraine and he looks up at the moon, maybe on one particularly full moon, beautiful night, and he starts thinking about going to the moon. And he doesn't think about going to the moon like you and I might think about going to the moon. I mean, he actually starts thinking about going to the moon. Like, how would you actually go to the moon? And he starts kind of playing it out in his mind, which again is just extraordinary. But there he is, 20 years old, trying to figure out how to go to the moon. And he comes up with this idea called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which I'll explain more here in a couple of minutes. But the important thing to keep in mind right now is that Lunar Orbit Rendezvous is not only how we ultimately went to the moon, it is to this day the only way people have figured out how to go to the moon. So, you know, an amazing leap of imagination. And just, I think just a phenomenal inspiration to think about this guy again in 1916, seriously thinking about how to go to the moon. And of course, it's quite some time before we did that. But the bulk of this story is actually about this gentleman, John Houbolt. So you have to fast forward to the early 60s. John Houbolt is an aerospace engineer at the Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. And, you know, it's hard to believe, but when Kennedy gave his speech at Rice University saying we're going to go to the moon, they actually hadn't figured out how to go to the moon yet. They were still discussing different options, one of which was putting a couple of spacecraft together in Earth orbit and then flying that to the moon. And another of which was championed by Wernher von Braun, who was Kennedy's kind of leading rocket guy at the time. This other idea was just to build a big, ginormous rocket and just blast the whole thing off and go land on the moon with this big, gigantic rocket. That idea had a lot of traction inside of NASA because of von Braun's gravitas inside the organization. But you know, the mechanics were if you landed on the moon, you'd be 70 feet off the ground, and it was a little unclear how the astronauts would get out of the rocket and then back up. But somewhere in his research, Houbolt starts looking around, and he finds this paper from Yuri talking about Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And this is a sketch of Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And basically what it means is you take a rocket into Earth orbit, and that rocket carries both a spacecraft that can survive Earth reentry and being able to come back through the Earth's atmosphere, as well as a smaller, much lighter spacecraft that can go and land on the moon and come back up, while the main spacecraft, the one that's stronger and heavier, stays in orbit around the moon. And so the spacecrafts dock together and get into the configuration while they're in Earth orbit, and then they fly to the moon. The smaller craft disconnects from the main craft, lands on the surface, then comes back up. Hence Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, because they're going to do a rendezvous when they're in lunar orbit. Certain practicalness to how they name these things. So that was the idea. And here's John Houbolt standing in front of a fantastic chalkboard sketch. These guys had phenomenal whiteboard handwriting or chalkboard handwriting. Look at that. I've sat in so many meetings with whiteboards. I've never seen whiteboard writing that well, that good. That's good stuff. So if we start looking at the timeline, John comes up, he discovers or comes across this idea of lunar orbit rendezvous. Again, it's not his idea, but he begins to realize, like, this is the idea. This is how we're going to do it. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, 1957, Sputnik goes into orbit. A little over 3 years later, Hubble presents to the U.S. Air Force Scientific Advisory Board at the Pentagon talking about lunar orbit rendezvous. He pitches it to the Space Task Force the next month. Yuri Gagarin's the first human in space a little while later. That kind of shocked everybody in the U.S. again as well. The next month, Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space, but it's always worth pointing out that Yuri Gagarin orbited. Alan just went up and came back down, even though they're closely linked in time. Very, very different accomplishments. Same month, May 1961, Kennedy proposes the going to the moon to Congress. This was an effort to leapfrog the Soviet program, because they just didn't believe that the Soviets could. They just thought that if they kind of changed the goal line and said, well, instead of putting a bunch of stuff into Earth orbit, we're just going to go to the moon. They didn't think the Soviets could do that. They thought it was something that the Americans could do and accomplish before the Soviets could. But that's in May of '61. Then later that same year, the Heaton Committee submits their report on the direct ascent. This is what I described earlier with the big giant rocket that's just going to go to the moon and come back. NASA publishes a 2-volume report about lunar orbit rendezvous in October of that year. Hubble sends a 9-page letter that's this phenomenal. It's the most famous memo in the history of NASA. It starts out somewhat as a voice in the wilderness, and then it goes on. Do we want to go to the moon or not? And if so, why do we have to restrict our thinking to certain narrow channels? And he goes on. You can actually see this memo. It's about a 50-page memo, and it's typewritten, and it includes all the data as to why lunar orbit rendezvous is going to work. It has all the calculations for how much the lunar module was going to weigh and everything that was going to be involved to do it. It's very, very persuasive. And he went around the chain of command. So this is kind of what I mean with you have to have the courage of your convictions. Like, this is something that Hubble could have easily gotten fired over. But he believes so strongly that this was the right thing to do that he sent it right to the very top brass in NASA to try to get them to commit to doing this. So he's kind of waging a one-person war, trying to push this idea through NASA, which, as you can imagine, is a very buttoned-up, hierarchical, challenging organization. And then shortly thereafter, July 1962, I say shortly thereafter, it was that 8 months difference. They announced that that's how they're going to go to the moon. I want to point out, July 1962, they land on the moon in July 1969, 7 years later. And of course, Kennedy had set this deadline of landing and returning safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. So they have this deadline going the whole time, just clocking down. And they've now spent essentially about 2.5 years, trying to figure out how they're going to go to the moon, like debating these different methods, so that by the time we really start, Kennedy announces the whole thing at Rice University, and now the public's fully engaged. And it's not until November of 1962 when Grumman Aircraft in, I believe, in upper state New York gets awarded the contract to build the LEM. So they get this contract in 1962, and they've got to design, develop, and build multiple instances of a spacecraft that can land on the moon, the first true spacecraft, the first thing that's ever been built to truly fly only in space. And they've got less than 7 years to pull, about 7 years to pull this thing off. Like, it is from day one, the long pole in the whole thing going to the moon. And for this audience in particular, you guys will be interested to know that the very first contract that they signed was the contract to develop the guidance computer that was on the LEM. And what's fascinating about that particular computer, it was the first time that the main constraint for the computer was how small it was. Up until 1962, if you wanted to show off how great your computer was, you'd talk about how big it was. But after November 1962, when we had to get a small computer on board an actual spacecraft to land on the moon, the conversation completely switches. And now it's about how small and how light is my computer. And if you want to nerd out and you want to get into the Apollo stuff, go and read about the navigation computer on board the LEM. It is absolutely fascinating how the computer worked. All those computers that landed are sitting on the moon today. The memory is what's called rope core memory. Like, theoretically, if you could get back to them, you could run that software again. And that's a whole other talk. And if somebody wants to ask about it in Q&A, I can talk about it more. But that whole thing's just amazing. My point here is the timeline and how much Hubble had to continue to press for this method and how time was just going on. But eventually he does, of course, win the argument. And as Neil Armstrong stepped on the surface, Werner von Braun is in the control center, and John Hubolt's there nearby. And it's obviously a big moment. And Werner von Braun looks over to John Hubolt and gives him the okay sign and said, John, it worked beautifully. So it's just an awesome moment. So this is the original sketch of what he originally called the Lunar Schooner. And then here's some other pictures from Apollo 11. And I've just got a couple of slides and not a lot of commentary left here, but I just kind of want to quickly go through a little slideshow here of the LEM. It's an unusual looking spacecraft. Again, I think creatively, you have to back up and imagine the brief that came in starting in November of '62 and like what you're going to build and all the different shapes that they must have experimented with. And one of the big innovations that they realized that the astronauts could fly standing up. And so once they took the seats out of the LEM, it meant that the astronauts could get much closer to the windows. And because they were closer to the windows could be much smaller, more like portholes. And because glass is an extremely heavy substance, and they were trying to cut down on weight, they could reduce the size of the windows. They could reduce the weight of the overall craft. And they have to solve this problem in multiple ways. And having the astronauts stand up was, that was a big difference. Here's a shot of it taken from the command module. And then with some of these pictures, and I hope you can see them pretty clearly, I just love looking at the wrinkles in the metal and all the mylar fabric. I mean, this is clearly something built by hand. There is nothing precise about this thing. It is clearly crafted by human hands. Another one of it on the moon. Here you can see one of the landing pads, the flag there in the background. You kind of get it. This gives you a good sense of the scale. One of the interesting things about the LEM, of course, is it both has to land. So it's got the descent stage, which is the bottom part that the legs are attached to. And then when it lifts back off the moon, it's only that top part where the astronauts were that lifted off. That's the ascent stage. And the ascent engine, the rocket that helped them get back off the moon, is the only thing in the entire daisy chain of events to get people to the moon and back. It's the only system where there's no backup. If that engine doesn't fire properly and it doesn't light up the way it's supposed to, they're dead on the moon. That's it. There is no recovery plan. There is no backup. That is the single point of failure in the whole thing, is the engine that gets them back off. But again, hopefully you can kind of see this clearly. This thing is clearly made by hand. Here you see one of the astronauts, backing out of this thing like they're getting out of some sort of backpacking tent or something. And here's an amazing shot of the LEM and the rover. This would have been from one of the later missions when they had the rovers. They're on the darkness of the moon. And I hope, in the same way, I hope maybe you get a chance to read some Dr. Seuss books pretty soon. I hope in the next couple of nights you'll be outside and you'll take a look up at the moon, and maybe it's going to be a full moon, and you'll sit and you'll look at it and you'll really try to understand in your head the notion of going to the moon and walking on the moon. We landed there 6 times. 12 different people walked on the moon. The last ones were there for 4 days and spent quite a bit of time. They spent 4 8-hour days walking around the moon, doing experiments and gathering samples and stuff. It is just mind-boggling to this day to me to go out and look at the moon and really think about that accomplishment. So 3 stories in conclusion. Here we go. Conditions change. Make sure that your thinking does as well. Dr. Seuss, embrace the constraints and learn to dance with them. They will take you places you could have never imagined. And conviction. Be sure you have it. Even the best ideas need defenders and champions. I'm pretty sure I don't have to repeat this to this audience. I understand a lot of you are founders. Founders have more conviction than anybody I've ever seen. I think that is probably the single most seen superpower of founders. They have incredible conviction around their ideas. And that is it for me. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Bob. I love being transported to so many different contexts and literally a different world. And love how different stories can teach us lessons and kind of take us out of our day-to-day, hopefully to think a bit bigger. We did have a question to kick off with, if you're ready.
Yeah.
To start that portion. One of our attendees asked kind of on the idea of constraints. It looks like, constraints really may have boosted, of course, Dr. Seuss's creativity, but a lot of conventional wisdom, in their opinion, says that constraints can be bad for creativity. Just would love your input, and definitely see companies that can do more with less. So would love to, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think the question is getting at two different kinds of constraints. One was a resourcing constraint, and the other one was sort of defining the problem space. Um, Trying to do too much with too few people is a different kind of challenge, and that's really a question of prioritization. So I'll leave that aside for a second. I can tell you, as a creative professional and somebody who's been designing software products and leading teams for 3 decades, the worst thing you can do is to give me a lot of space and a lot of time. Like, every creative I know, we're master procrastinators. We will always put off finishing the thing. If we have a big giant open field, we don't quite know how to get started. So I'm a big believer in like a really well-defined problem space. And then the other piece that I like is making sure that you have to show progress on a steady basis. So the team that I ran at Apple, which designed the Apple online store, and again with my team at ThoughtSpot, one of the patterns I get into is the team has to show me work basically every 48 hours. So we are constantly looking at work, and it keeps people from getting too caught up in their own heads and wandering off in the wrong direction, and it keeps us together as a team, and it really reduces a lot of I think the emotional creative pressure on people. I was talking to a buddy yesterday, and we were talking about the value of a structure and how much all of us are struggling now that we're working at home, and how do you structure your day and how do you put up these boundaries. And we're talking about how you kind of get in, these habit tracking things. You try to schedule time in a certain way. And I just kind of came up with this metaphor. The thing about structure is the difference between, an empty field and a baseball diamond, right? Like, you can't have a game if you don't have the diamond. You can't make progress if you don't have the diamond. Like, you got to have some boundaries to make progress, and a ton of amazing art. If you really go back and you look at like Chopin's Preludes or Bach's Goldberg Variations, there's a ton of different great artistic achievement that was set up as a problem, like a technical problem that the artist was trying to solve, and they go into the work that way. So it's not. Picasso doesn't just show up at the well, maybe Picasso does, but most artists don't just show up at the canvas and see where it goes. Like, they're trying to accomplish something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that goes into kind of something we're talking about right before we jumped on to broadcasting, which is, obviously we have a lot of new conditions, and conditions have changed. We have a lot of new constraints, and one of which is that we're not, with each other. What are your thoughts on kind of this like work from anywhere current situation and condition, and where do you see it going? Is it here to stay? What does it look like?
Yeah, so we're struggling with that at ThoughtSpot. Just for a little bit of context, we're about a 600 person company. We have maybe 400 people here in the U.S. and about 200 in Bangalore. And the people in the Western Europe and the U.S. there's also a significant sales organization that's scattered in different offices. We've obviously been working from home since mid-March, and there's sort of a debate inside the company as to whether or not we're going to go back to the office. I'm on the side that says there's no great reason to go back to the office. We could sit and we could pine about how we can't see each other in the hallways and we can't have these interruptions and stuff. I can assure you, as someone leading design teams, that I am really glad to not have those interruptions. So if you're one of those people that's missing being able to interrupt your design people, I actually kind of enjoy not being interrupted by you. So it's a little bit of a split there. I always try to get my team to separate the idea of working from anywhere from the idea of the lockdown, and so I'll say to my team, I know you're getting frustrated, but imagine your kids are still going to school, and imagine you can go work at the Starbucks and you can go see your friends for lunch, and you can work from Hawaii if you want. Like, how does that feel? And most people say, oh my God, that feels awesome. And then I'm sort of like, okay, so look, it's not, it's not the working from home thing, it's the lockdown. And the lockdown is not something within our control as individual companies or individual citizens. And so you have to kind of parse those two. For the founders out there that are kind of wondering about how to manage work from anywhere and what some of the best practices are, there is a lot of best practices on this topic. Obviously, remote by the guys that do Basecamp. Matt Mullerweg with Automatic's done some stuff. The company that develops Twist, I think it's called Dallas. They're out of Europe. They've 600 people, I think, fully remote. Envision's fully remote. I mean, companies have figured this out, and you can follow their playbook. There's actually a company, GitHub, has a 3,000 page wiki that's all about how to work from home and like what their culture is. So I firmly believe that we can make this work. And I think there's some unique benefits to working from anywhere. The fact that we can do things like this. We just had a all company event with, a few hundred people from around the globe, and we wouldn't have done that in the past. I mean, if we had, it would have been a huge deal and it would cost us enormous amount of money. So I think it's, as I was saying, you got to dance with the constraints and stop thinking about what you've lost by not being in the office and start thinking about what you've gained, because you've gained a lot.
Absolutely. Well, we're getting lots of questions, which is a good problem to have. I'll put in one that I feel like is a nice segue, which is from Chris Liu, who says, we just hired someone to do our social media and digital content. What can we, the founders, do to help them be most creative and set the right constraints without setting too many?
Yeah. So in all design problems, what you're trying to do is help the person decide, understand the problem. Don't get prescriptive about the solutions. Try to make sure we're trying to accomplish this goal. There's lots of different ways to do it. Why don't you come back with solutions to that? And then you're kind of evaluating the design solution in the context of the goal. And a story I tell is a company I was working at years ago. We had a home page and there was a link on the page, and the product manager, somebody that said, Bob, you have to make that link blue. And I was like, well, why do we have to make it blue? They're like, just make it blue. And we got in this debate about it being blue. And then they kind of went behind my back. And I said, no, I don't want to, it's like, that's going to ruin the aesthetic of the page. And they said, well, I want to, they went behind my back and they made it blue. And then we had a heated discussion in the hallway. I eventually said, well, what was it you were trying to accomplish by making it blue? They're like, well, people couldn't see it. And I was like, oh, so it wasn't prominent enough. And she's like, yeah, it wasn't prominent enough. I'm like, okay, great. Well, we're like professional graphic designers. We have 15 ways to make it more prominent, one of which is making it blue. What you did is you leapt to a solution and you didn't really present the problem to us. And I think for founders and executives, like in all my design reviews when I'm working with executives, I spend most of the conversation trying to get them to more specifically narrow down our understanding of the problem and to make sure that we're on the same page with the problem. And the benefit of doing that is that when you find the right solution, everybody will agree. So I also often get questions about, how do you resolve creative conflicts between different design solutions? And I always kind of say that means you haven't agreed on the problem, because if you had a shared understanding of the problem, the solution would be obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, topic of, solving problems, Steve also asked a question around, so many problems and challenges have multiple ways to solve them. How do you and your team tend to figure out which problems to solve and which ones to defer or either, ignore or tackle later?
Full disclosure, Steve and I are really good friends, and he's trolling me from Boston. So, hey, Steve, good to see you. I wish you were a little bit more specific here. So many problems and challenges. I can't tell if you're talking about like product prioritization, or how to I'm not exactly sure what types of problems you're talking about, but I'm going to use it as a leaping off story for one of my favorite, a leaping off point for one of my favorite Steve stories, which I think is relevant. So when they were getting ready to work on Keynote for the first time, Steve goes to Roger Rosner, who was the VP of engineering responsible for iWork. And Roger kind of says, hey, Steve, how should we think about Keynote? We got to compete with PowerPoint. There's already these other presentation packages. What should we do? And Steve said, Roger, there's three things with Keynote. One is it should be really difficult to make ugly presentations. Two, you should focus on beautiful cinematic transitions. And three, you should optimize for innovation over PowerPoint compatibility. And so I use those as examples of like really strong tenets, because each one of those statements, like if we just take the last one, optimize for innovation over PowerPoint compatibility, like you could imagine the thousands of hours of debate that the product team would have had if they didn't have clarity on which side of that debate to be on. And Steve just sort of said straight off the bat, difficult to make ugly presentations. Okay, that's a whole set of things to take out of the way. Beautiful cinematic transitions, which to this day is the hallmark of Keynote and why I can't stand using Google Slides or PowerPoint, right? Like that's a very clear direction. And so I think a lot of times when you're trying to figure out what to go do, like, do you really have clarity around the tenets? Because if you have that clarity, I think the priorities kind of fall out much quicker. Yeah. And Steve, just call me later. We'll talk about it more.
Exactly. Excellent. Our next question is from Will, who talks about kind of how you balance creativity with, meeting a deadline or a milestone. So kind of what signals do you look for in your own work that indicate you need to engage on the creative side more deeply versus, buckling down and getting it done?
Yeah, this is an interesting question we've been dealing with internally at ThoughtSpot is, when does something pivot from being sort of exploratory creative work to execution mode? And it's always, it's a delicate balance, and it's a little bit like, like watching these projects is a little bit like being a parent, like when do you give your kid that extra thing to go do their, like when do you let them go further versus when do you kind of stay closer to them? There is a point with almost every project where the team has some sense of, no, this is really what we want to go do. And I can't give you a rubric for how to judge that, but you can usually feel it in the room. Like the debates are becoming more and more myopic, and you don't seem to be making the same level of progress. And there seems to be general agreement that this is the thing we want to go do. And at that point, like you kind of have to pivot into execution mode. And there's a point where you just have to sit down and finish the thing. And actually, as a creative, I really enjoy working in both those modes, because it's emotionally draining to sit in that level of uncertainty of kind of wondering what we're doing. Like that's really hard to sit in indefinitely. And there's a point when it's actually really rewarding to put all that uncertainty behind you and just go and finish the dang thing. And we tend to do that with deadlines. We sign up for some sort of commitment. Maybe there's a company event, then you have to have a demo ready to show, which is what drove some of our work at ThoughtSpot last week. Maybe you have to give a presentation like this. You sign up for different kinds of commitments, and then you can use that commitment as a forcing function. You might also look at Adam Grant's book. God, what was the name of his first book? It was about innovation. Anyway, Harvard Business School professor Adam Grant, The Originalists, I think is the name of the book. And he talks about this idea of precrastination, and that some of the most original thinkers, you would give them the problem, and they would start kind of thinking really quickly in their head, and then it would look like nothing was going on for a long time, and then they'd come out with something at the end. So there is this, again, it's sort of this dark art of when has the problem had enough time to marinate. And when does it seem solid enough, and then you can kind of punt into execution.
Oh, on mute. Yeah, absolutely. On that note, we had a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, how do you find inspiration for design during kind of your initial brainstorming phases? And then also separately, do you have kind of some books that you would recommend around design?
Yeah, I mean, I have a handful of books over there on design. Yeah, it's Elements of Typographic Style by William Bringhurst, and then maybe Designing for Humans by William Dreyfus. There's another one. Yeah, I might stick with those two right now. I guess it kind of depends on what kind of inspiration you're looking for. Lately, I found a lot of inspiration in video games. So I think there's a tremendous amount of really interesting computing concepts, UI concepts, product concepts that are floating through video games. I'm not personally a big gamer, but my 21-year-old son is an enormous gamer, and he's kind of constantly showing me stuff. So I think gaming is a really interesting area to look at. I also, in terms of software, I spend a lot of time just looking around in the world. I'm kind of the annoying guy at the deli that has to look at the point of sale system. Like how does the Clover UI actually work? And I sit and chat with people about self-checkout at Safeway and how it sucks and why it sucks. So there are software products everywhere. And so there's tons of inspiration to be found just kind of looking around the normal world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to start wrapping it up because I know everyone usually is like right back to back, 12 to 1 Pacific. So I want to make sure people get a tiny break and to do a few plugs, and also just to say huge thank you to Bob for joining us today. We did get one question around the relationship between Katherine Johnson and John Hubel around the Apollo mission. So I don't know if you have any recommendations of where people can learn more.
Yeah, there's obviously tons and tons more Apollo history that's coming out, and I'm sorry to say I don't know a ton about that part of it. There's a whole other big chunk of books out there. There was a lot of books that came out around the 50th anniversary last year. So the one that I read was Man on the Moon. I think it's Man on the Moon by Andrew Chaikin, which came out probably 15, 20 years ago. It was the basis of the HBO docudrama series, although he doesn't talk a lot about There was a woman, Poppy, I can't remember her last name, who was the only woman that was in mission control. And then the woman that you mentioned. There's a fantastic podcast that came out last summer as well called 13 Minutes to the Moon. And they did a season last summer about Apollo 11, and then they did a season more recently about Apollo 13. And it's, obviously a huge podcast junkie as well. And it's one of my favorite and best produced, most dramatic podcasts. And it talks a lot about the technology and the missions, but it also mentions a little bit about the role of some of the key linchpin women involved in the mission. I mean, like 400,000 people worked to get those guys on the moon. It is a huge national effort. And there are so many stories that are all unbelievably inspiring, and so many different people, different genders and different countries and different racial makeups. There's so many different people that contributed that we still haven't heard all their stories. So it's lots of material to mine there.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing, Bob, and thank you so much for joining us today. This just like energized me to go back into problem solving and view my constraints and conditions as opportunities. So thank you so much for that. And just a quick plug that we do have upcoming speaker series events. We're kind of doing these, we were doing them weekly, now we're doing them monthly. Next up, we have Nikhil Singhal, who's gonna be talking about product management, so specifically around product market fit, testing products, how to hire your first PM. So super excited to welcome him. I believe it's August 18th, but you can check us out at pair.bc/speakers. And we've been doing awesome Medium posts on all these speaker events. So if you don't get a chance to watch live all of our events, you can read quick summaries and also see them on YouTube. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here today. Huge thank you to Bob, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon, evening, wherever you are.